The kingdom of Iron Vale had long carried a reputation that echoed across mountains and valleys, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and awe. Towering walls of blackened stone, etched with the scars of countless battles and reinforced by iron bands, encircled the city, cutting it off from the surrounding lands. Here, life was ruled by the iron hand of Lord Malric, a sovereign whose paranoia rivaled his cruelty. Tales of his wrath were told to children to keep them obedient, and whispers of dissenters disappearing into the shadows were common. None dared speak openly against him. The penalty for defiance was exile, imprisonment, or death. Yet, it was in this kingdom of iron and shadows that Kayla, a young woman of remarkable courage and intelligence, would rise, not as a conqueror in the conventional sense, but as a force born from the very depths of oppression. Kayla had grown up in the northern districts of Iron Vale, a place where cobblestone streets twisted like serpents and the markets bustled with a chaotic energy. She had been raised on stories of valor and intellect, taught by parents who valued knowledge above wealth, who instilled in her an unwavering belief in justice and cunning. From a young age, Kayla exhibited a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of empathy. While other children learned to obey without question, Kayla questioned everything: laws, edicts, and the reasoning behind the cruel traditions of Iron Vale. Her curiosity was both her strength and, ultimately, her doom. The first seed of trouble sprouted when Kayla openly challenged a decree that imposed additional labor upon the poorer districts. The Lord's emissaries were quick to report her defiance, interpreting her words as sedition. But Kayla was not one to mince words. She spoke passionately about fairness, about the suffering of those overlooked, and about the folly of fear-driven rule. Her words traveled like sparks in a dry forest, igniting murmurs of hope in some hearts and the deadly ire of authority in others. To Lord Malric she was a threat, not merely because of what she said but because her words inspired thought, and thought was dangerous in a kingdom built on obedience. It was during the Festival of Iron, a grand celebration designed to reinforce the Lord's supremacy, that Kayla's fate was sealed. Standing among the crowd, she witnessed a young worker publicly flogged for a minor misdeed. The punishment was intended as a spectacle, a warning to all who might consider disobedience. Unable to remain silent, Kayla stepped forward, her voice carrying above the crowd as she questioned the justice of the act. The young worker's eyes filled with hope as whispers of agreement spread through the onlookers. That was the moment Lord Malric decided she must be removed, not only for her defiance but to prevent her growing influence from spreading like wildfire. Kayla was seized that evening, the clang of iron on iron resonating through the streets as she was bound and escorted to the royal dungeon. The journey was silent, save for the occasional muttered curses from the guards, who seemed both fearful and wary of the young woman they were transporting. The dungeon itself was a vast network of stone corridors, dimly lit by torches that flickered and cast long, twisting shadows. It smelled of damp earth, rust, and centuries of despair. Doors of reinforced iron sealed each cell, and narrow slits high on the walls allowed only the faintest whispers of sunlight or wind. For many, the dungeon was a place of hopelessness, designed to break both body and spirit. But for Kayla, it was the beginning of a different kind of awakening. At first, the darkness was suffocating. The silence pressed upon her chest, and the cold stone walls seemed to close in with every passing hour. Guards would deliver meager rations and leave, their footsteps echoing like distant thunder. Days blurred into nights, and nights into a monotonous rhythm of isolation. Kayla could feel the weight of the Lord's power pressing down on her, but she refused to yield. The chains that bound her wrists were cold and unyielding, but they were no match for the fire of her mind. In the solitude she began to listen, not just to the sounds of the dungeon, but to the subtle vibrations of the stones themselves, the faint creaks and sighs that spoke of history and hidden passageways. She began to map the dungeon in her mind, recalling stories of secret tunnels used centuries ago by rebels and prisoners. Knowledge became her companion, thought became her shield. As weeks passed, Kayla discovered that the dungeon was more than a prison. It was a living entity, resonating with the energies of those who had been confined there before. Whispers of past prisoners, murmurs of failed rebellions, and even fragments of secret strategies echoed faintly through the walls. She could feel them almost as if the stone itself remembered. In this realization, Kayla found a strange comfort. What was designed to strip her of autonomy instead offered her perspective, a deeper understanding of the very kingdom that had sought to crush her spirit. Kayla's intelligence became her greatest weapon. She observed the guards, noting their patterns, their moments of vulnerability, and the subtle alliances among them. Some were cruel, some apathetic, and a few she realized were sympathetic but too fearful to act openly. To the latter, she began to communicate through small signs, gestures, and notes left in places they would discover. Her words were careful, coded, but potent, planting seeds of thought and courage. She learned to read the language of fear and obedience that the guards spoke through their actions, and she adapted, using it to her advantage. Beyond the human elements, Kayla also began to study the dungeon itself. Walls that seemed solid bore faint cracks, and stones that appeared immovable hummed under her touch. She discovered hidden niches where supplies could be smuggled, narrow vents where messages could be passed, and passages overlooked by the careless. Each discovery added to her confidence and broadened her understanding. The dungeon that had been meant to contain her could, in time, serve as a realm she could control. The very chains, iron doors, and shadowed corridors were becoming tools in her mind, instruments through which she could extend influence beyond her cell. Kayla also embraced the psychological aspect of her imprisonment. She understood that the Lord's fear stemmed from her spirit, not her body, and that power often lay in perception. By projecting calm, intelligence, and quiet defiance, she began to alter the demeanor of those who came near. Kayla found herself mastering the art of indirect control. She learned how to manipulate the small advantages in her environment, the way light shifted through the bars, the sound of water dripping from the ceilings, the placement of guards and their predictable routines. Every observation fed into a larger strategy, every interaction a lesson in human psychology and power dynamics. She began keeping a mental ledger of strengths and weaknesses, not just of individuals, but of the entire system that supported the tyrant's rule. By understanding the mechanics of oppression, Kayla realized she could wield power without ever stepping beyond the stone walls. Her kingdom was growing in shadows, quietly and inexorably. Yet, the dungeon was not merely a place of study. It was also a space of reflection. Kayla often sat for hours in the dark, listening to her own thoughts, examining the nature of power, fear, and loyalty. She remembered the faces of those who had suffered under the Lord's rule, the markets where injustice went unpunished, the children who had learned obedience through intimidation. Each memory fueled her resolve. The knowledge that the dungeon's chains were meant to crush her spirit only strengthened her will. She began to see herself as the inheritor not just of her own freedom, but of the kingdom's moral reckoning. Through endurance, intellect, and careful observation, Kayla's spirit transformed from captive to ruler, though her throne was for the moment hidden in stone and shadow. Even the isolation itself became a teacher. She discovered patterns in silence, rhythms in footsteps, and a strange harmony in the seemingly chaotic sounds of the dungeon. Birds that sometimes perched near the upper vents, rats that scurried in the corners, and the distant echoes of other prisoners, real or imagined, formed a network of subtle intelligence. Kayla learned to anticipate movements, predict outcomes, and develop strategies that leveraged even the smallest variables. Where others saw a barren, hopeless dungeon, she saw a dynamic ecosystem of influence. Her understanding of this environment would later allow her to turn the dungeon into a base of operations, a hidden kingdom where knowledge, patience, and cunning became her allies. Kayla also began to cultivate alliances with those she could trust. Even minor gestures, an approving nod, a shared glance, a carefully dropped note, became threads in a network of silent resistance. She taught them, through example and subtle instruction, to perceive the world not through fear but through understanding. While the Lord believed her spirit broken, her influence quietly spread through the dungeon, reaching even the most downtrodden. Her leadership was subtle at first, imperceptible to those in power, but the foundations of her eventual kingdom were being laid in these hidden corridors. Over time, Kayla discovered that the dungeon contained secrets beyond its walls. There were passages that led to forgotten armories, old storage rooms filled with supplies, and even escape routes neglected by the Lord in his arrogance. She committed these to memory, envisioning how each could be used in the right moment. By studying the patterns of guards and the physical structure of the dungeon, Kayla began constructing a mental map of power and possibility. Her confinement, which had been meant to strip her of agency, was paradoxically granting her an intimate understanding of the kingdom's vulnerabilities. In these months of enforced solitude, Kayla underwent a transformation. The young woman who had entered the dungeon, frightened and outraged, became a strategist, philosopher, and quietly commanding figure. She had learned patience, discipline, and the subtle art of influence. The dungeon, with all its darkness, cold stone, and iron, had forged her into something far more formidable than any courtly intrigue or battlefield might have achieved. It had become her kingdom, not through conquest of others, but through mastery of self and environment, and through the quiet accumulation of knowledge, alliances, and power. By the time Kayla reached the 2-year mark of her imprisonment, she had become a legend in whispers among the dungeon's denizens. Guards and prisoners alike spoke of the young woman who had been locked away yet seemed untouched by despair. Some claimed she could hear secrets carried on the wind through the narrow vents. Others said her gaze alone inspired reflection or fear. Her reputation, growing invisibly, ensured that she commanded respect even without lifting a hand. She had learned that true power often lay not in brute force but in perception, patience and understanding, skills that would later allow her to transform the dungeon into her very own kingdom. Kayla's mind was now a vault of strategy, the dungeon her training ground. Each day had been a lesson in endurance, observation and subtle manipulation. The very instruments of her captivity, the chains, the iron doors and the shadows, had become tools of mastery. By understanding the systems of fear and authority, she positioned herself to convert the dungeon into a realm where knowledge, patience and intellect reigned supreme. Where once she had been imprisoned, Kayla now reigned in influence, a hidden queen whose power grew from the very depths of the stone and iron meant to contain her. Kayla is thrown into the dungeon, its walls cold and damp, the air thick with despair. She encounters other prisoners, some broken, some quietly defiant. Time feels distorted, days bleed into nights and the faint sounds of the outside world tease her senses. She learns to navigate the darkness, finding hidden cracks, damp corners and forgotten tools that could aid her survival. Despite the grim surroundings, Kayla begins observing patterns, the guards' routines, the weak spots in the structure, and the moods of fellow captives. She discovers that the dungeon is more than a prison. It is a microcosm of the kingdom itself, reflecting its fears, corruption, and hierarchy. Through quiet observation, she begins plotting small ways to turn her disadvantage into opportunity, realizing that power can be cultivated even in chains. Kayla also discovers a hidden passage behind a loose stone, though it is blocked and dangerous. This first glimpse of possibility fuels her determination. She befriends a prisoner, an older woman with wisdom and secrets of the dungeon, who whispers tales of those who survived through cunning rather than brute strength. Nightly, Kayla listens to the echoes, moans, dripping water, distant laughter, and begins hearing patterns, almost as if the dungeon speaks to her. She realizes that in understanding the dungeon, she can bend its logic to her advantage. Even in darkness, she begins to sense a strange rhythm, a pulse that might become her ally. The chapter emphasizes Kayla's growing intelligence, her patience, and her ability to see opportunity where others see only despair. By the end, she begins to claim the dungeon not just as a prison, but as a space she can learn from, shaping the foundation for her future kingdom. Kayla begins to notice that not all prisoners are entirely broken by the dungeon. Some retain flickers of defiance, hidden skills, or quiet intelligence. She starts observing them carefully, understanding who can be trusted and who is too fearful or loyal to the tyrant. Through subtle gestures, shared glances, and whispered words, Kayla begins forming connections, building a network of allies within the dungeon walls. One of her first allies is a former soldier, imprisoned for refusing to execute an unjust order. He knows the patterns of guards, the weaknesses in locks, and the hidden ways through the lower levels. Another is a healer, quietly tending to the sick or wounded, who possesses knowledge of herbs, poisons, and salves that could aid in survival or defense. Slowly, Kayla begins weaving these skills into a hidden plan, a map of the dungeon's inner workings that only her trusted few can navigate. They begin to communicate through secret codes, passing small notes and using gestures as even the walls seem to have ears. Kayla discovers that patience is as powerful as physical strength. By waiting, observing, and testing limits, she can turn small advantages into larger ones. The group starts experimenting, quietly exploring passages, testing guard routines, and sharing knowledge without attracting attention. Kayla's intelligence shines as she recognizes that the dungeon itself is alive in a sense. Every sound, every guard's movement, every cracked stone can be read, interpreted, and used. She encourages her allies to see the dungeon not as a prison but as a space where they can cultivate power. Even despair becomes a tool. Fear of punishment is transformed into disciplined planning and subtle acts of resistance. The chapter emphasizes trust, strategy, and leadership. Kayla grows into a figure others look to, not by asserting dominance, but by inspiring confidence. By the end of this stage, she has transformed the shadows of the dungeon into a network of hidden allies, preparing the foundation for turning their confinement into a kingdom of their own making. As Kayla spends more time exploring the dungeon, she begins to notice patterns in the walls themselves. Faint scratches, discolorations, and carvings suggest messages left by previous prisoners, warnings, instructions, and symbols of hope. At first, they are confusing, but her keen mind deciphers them gradually. Each mark tells a story: where a guard hides, which stones are loose, where water seeps and can be used to hide tools, and even secret passages long forgotten. She discovers hidden chambers behind false walls, filled with remnants of past captives. Dried herbs, small tools, scraps of parchment with coded writings. Some chambers contain primitive weapons or devices meant to aid escape or survival. Kayla realizes that the dungeon itself has a memory, a history of those who came before her, those who resisted in silence. This knowledge sparks a new confidence within her. Using the clues, Kayla begins mapping the dungeon in her mind. She notices that the guards follow strict routines, leaving certain sections unguarded at predictable times. By observing these patterns, she and her allies can move with minimal risk. Each exploration strengthens her understanding, and she starts teaching her companions the language of the walls, how to read cracks, shadows, and echoes to anticipate events before they happen. The dungeon transforms from a place of despair into a school of strategy and resilience. Kayla experiments with the marks, adding her own subtle signs to guide or mislead. Her ingenuity turns confinement into a controlled environment where knowledge becomes a weapon. The walls themselves, once silent witnesses to suffering, now whisper their secrets, guiding the prisoners toward empowerment. By the end of this stage, Kayla and her allies no longer see the dungeon as a prison. They recognize it as a living entity, one that has tested countless captives and now is offering them tools to reclaim agency. They have learned patience, observation, and the power of subtlety. The dungeon is no longer simply a place of punishment. It has become a kingdom of hidden knowledge and latent power, laying the foundation for Kayla's eventual rise. Kayla's network of allies grows quietly within the dungeon. Other prisoners, inspired by her insight and courage, begin to trust her guidance. She teaches them the language of the walls, how to read hidden signs, anticipate guard patterns, and use the dungeon's architecture to their advantage. Even spectral presences, the lingering spirits of those who died resisting, seem to guide her, revealing secret passages and weak points in the walls. Together they start small acts of rebellion. Locks are tampered with, supplies are hidden or rerouted, and messages are left for allies to find. Each action is deliberate, careful, and strategic, building confidence among the prisoners. The dungeon, once a symbol of despair, now hums with quiet defiance. Every hidden chamber, every shadowed corner becomes a stage for subtle victories, and Kayla learns to coordinate these efforts without drawing the attention of the guards. Kayla also experiments with ways to communicate with the outside world. She discovers that sounds, vibrations, and even whispered words through stone corridors can travel farther than anyone expects. Messages reach sympathetic townsfolk who begin to wonder if the prisoners are not as powerless as the Lord believes. This hidden network forms the first threads of a rebellion that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, Kayla studies the weaknesses of her oppressors, their routines, superstitions, and overconfidence. She realizes that their fear of uprisings is as much a weakness as their physical limitations. By combining the dungeon's secrets with her allies' strengths, she starts orchestrating plans that will eventually turn captivity into leverage. The spark of rebellion grows quietly but steadily. Kayla understands that raw strength alone will not liberate them. It will be strategy, patience, and unity. Every successful act, no matter how small, feeds their courage and reshapes their perception of the dungeon, from a place of chains to a kingdom where knowledge, wit, and resolve are the true rulers. By the end of this stage, the prisoners are no longer merely surviving, they are preparing. Kayla's vision extends beyond escape. She sees the dungeon itself as a fortress, a crucible where power can be forged, and she begins to embrace the idea that her confinement may have been the very path to becoming a ruler within its walls. Kayla begins to assert her authority over the dungeon, not through brute force but through cunning, observation, and manipulation of her environment. The prisoners now see her as a leader. Even the spectral presences respond to her presence, guiding her to hidden levers, secret tunnels, and forgotten armories. She experiments with the dungeon's mechanisms, rusted gears, hidden locks, and narrow corridors, to create advantages that confound the guards. Torches flare at her command, shadows seem to move purposefully, and doors refuse to shut for those who wish to contain her. Her influence spreads quietly at first. Small, unexplained events unsettle the guards. Supplies vanish only to reappear in new places, chains loosen when a prisoner reaches for them, and whispers echo through the corridors at odd intervals, sowing fear and confusion. Kayla's growing mastery of the dungeon demonstrates that captivity can be transformed into dominion. The walls themselves, once instruments of oppression, now respond to her intent, amplifying her power and presence. Prisoners begin to follow her guidance without hesitation. Under her instruction, they coordinate efforts to explore deeper tunnels, uncover forgotten treasures, and map every inch of their confinement. Each secret passage and hidden chamber becomes a node in a network she controls. Kayla realizes that leadership is not merely about giving orders. It is about inspiring confidence, fostering trust, and turning fear into respect. Even the guards, previously convinced of her helplessness, start to sense her growing influence. Their routines are disrupted in ways they cannot fully explain. A door that should lock remains open, a torch flares with no breeze, and eerie sounds reverberate through the stone corridors. Rumors begin to spread among the overseers and townsfolk. The prisoner is no ordinary woman. Something about the dungeon bends to her will. Kayla also cultivates her voice. Her words carry weight and authority, whether spoken to prisoners, whispered to shadows, or uttered in quiet chants that seem to awaken the dungeon itself. Her cunning grows sharper with every test, her plans more intricate, and her presence more commanding. She becomes the unseen ruler, the sovereign of shadows, who moves the chess pieces of confinement with precision. By the end of this stage, the dungeon is no longer merely a prison. It has become a kingdom of Kayla's own making, where fear, knowledge, and strategy replace chains and oppression. The guard's authority has waned, the prisoner's spirits have risen, and the dark halls themselves have come alive with her command. Kayla's reign of shadows demonstrates that even in the depths of imprisonment, power can be forged, controlled, and magnified, and that the confines meant to break her have instead made her a queen within the walls. Kayla begins putting her meticulously crafted plans into motion, turning the dungeon's very structure into an ally. Hidden passages, secret chambers, and forgotten tunnels become strategic points for movement and communication. Each prisoner, once isolated and fearful, is now trained to act with precision under her guidance. Their despair is transformed into discipline, their fear into focus, and their loyalty to her into a quiet, formidable force. Small, seemingly coincidental incidents unsettle the guards. A set of keys disappears and reappears in unexpected places. A corridor is found blocked by a fallen beam, or chains loosen at the precise moment a prisoner reaches for them. Kayla orchestrates these events with such subtlety that the overseers believe them to be accidents or supernatural occurrences. Yet every act is deliberate, designed to test, strengthen, and prepare her followers for the larger confrontation. Kayla herself moves like a shadow within her kingdom. She whispers instructions, coordinates movements, and communicates with spectral allies who guide her through hidden passages. She ensures the guards remain unaware of the growing organization around them, maintaining the illusion of compliance while sowing seeds of rebellion. Every mechanism, lever, and tunnel becomes part of her network. The prisoner's skills, once ignored or suppressed, are honed to serve the larger goal. Those adept with tools or locks become masters of stealthy sabotage. Those with strength are trained to manipulate heavy doors and barriers. Those with keen observation act as scouts and messengers. Kayla fosters an environment of mutual respect and shared purpose, instilling in them the belief that their imprisonment is not the end, but a stepping stone to liberation. Kayla also begins to expand her influence beyond the dungeon walls. Rumors of her mysterious power reach the town and castle above. Guards whisper about shadows moving against them, keys vanishing, and corridors acting as if alive. The Lord, once confident in his control, grows increasingly uneasy. Each strange occurrence weakens his authority, while Kayla's presence within the dungeon grows stronger. At night, the prisoners gather silently in hidden chambers. Kayla trains them in tactics, planning the ultimate escape and the reclamation of freedom. She also ensures they understand the importance of restraint. Any misuse of their abilities could reveal their plans prematurely. Every rehearsal, every whispered instruction, builds a synchronized force that is ready to act at her command. By the end of this stage, Kayla's dungeon is fully transformed into a kingdom of strategy and power. What was designed to imprison her now serves as the core of her growing dominion. Her prisoners are no longer victims but collaborators in her vision, and the guards, once symbols of unchallenged authority, are now pawns in a game they do not comprehend. Kayla's control over her environment, her allies, and the dungeon itself sets the stage for the ultimate confrontation, demonstrating that the deepest confinement can be the birthplace of unmatched sovereignty. After the confrontation with the tyrant lord, Kayla begins reshaping the dungeon into more than a place of confinement. Every dark corner, hidden chamber, and cold stone wall becomes a part of her vision, a kingdom built on strategy, loyalty, and the strength of those who once cowered in fear. She reorganizes spaces for training, communication, and communal gathering, turning areas that once symbolized despair into hubs of empowerment. Prisoners who survived the harsh conditions under her guidance now take pride in their new roles. Some maintain the mechanisms and secret passages, ensuring that the dungeon functions as Kayla intends. Others train not with weapons alone but in strategy, observation, and the subtle arts of influence and cunning. Even the shadows seem to serve her, lending a sense of omnipresence that reinforces her authority. The walls themselves become a testament to the transformation. Ancient markings and forgotten carvings are restored and enhanced, chronicling the journey of those who endured captivity. Symbols of resilience and cunning are etched where fear once reigned, teaching new arrivals that strength comes not from brute force, but from intelligence, patience, and solidarity. Kayla establishes a council of trusted allies, ensuring that leadership is shared among those who demonstrated courage and loyalty. Her power is not solitary, it is multiplied through collaboration, each person understanding that their contributions make the dungeon a living, breathing kingdom. Trust replaces fear, and the dungeon thrives on mutual respect rather than intimidation. Even the Lord, now a subdued presence, is allowed to witness the transformation. He observes how those he sought to control flourish under Kayla's guidance, realizing that authority rooted in oppression cannot endure. Every hallway and chamber reflects the shift. The dungeon that once represented helplessness now exudes order, intelligence, and a quiet majesty that commands respect. Kayla's kingdom within the dungeon is more than just a place, it is a symbol. Each prisoner-turned-citizen understands that confinement is temporary unless one surrenders to despair. By turning limitations into opportunities, Kayla shows that even the harshest conditions can become a platform for growth, leadership, and empowerment. Years later, the tale of Kayla spreads beyond the castle walls. Travelers, merchants, and wandering scholars speak in hushed tones of the woman who turned chains and stone into a kingdom. They tell of the dungeon that once imprisoned her now standing as a sanctuary of power, knowledge, and resilience, a place where the weak found strength, and the oppressed learned the art of strategy and self-mastery. Kayla herself is a legend. Her influence extends beyond the dungeon. The very methods she taught, patience, observation, and cleverness, become guiding principles for those seeking justice, leadership, or personal growth. Stories recount how she could command shadows, orchestrate outcomes without ever leaving her prison, and turn despair into opportunity. Parents teach their children about the Dungeon Queen not merely as a figure of fear, but as an example of cunning, intelligence, and perseverance. Those who arrive at the dungeon in later years find that its walls seem alive with Kayla's presence. Ancient markings still glow faintly in the dark, reminders that knowledge and resilience can flourish even in the harshest conditions. Prisoners-turned-citizens tell newcomers that freedom is not always the absence of walls. It is the mastery of one's mind, spirit, and influence within any circumstance. Kayla's story inspires other women and men alike, demonstrating that the chains meant to break a person can instead be tools of empowerment. Her life becomes a testament to the idea that limitation does not define ability, and captivity does not define destiny. The dungeon, once a symbol of fear, stands as a beacon of possibility, teaching generations that courage, intelligence, and strategic thought can turn oppression into sovereignty. A proverb emerges, whispered in villages and castles alike. They locked her in stone and shadow, but she built a kingdom from the very chains meant to bind her. Kayla's legacy endures, not as a tale of revenge or cruelty, but as a blueprint for turning adversity into authority, teaching that the greatest power often grows from the places where the world expects one to be broken. Her name becomes synonymous with cleverness, resilience, and the quiet, unstoppable force of a mind that refuses to yield. The tale of Kayla, the woman who had transformed a dungeon into a kingdom, spread slowly at first, whispered through corridors, marketplaces, and taverns, carried by travelers, merchants, and messengers. The story traveled far beyond the stone walls and iron gates where she had first been imprisoned, reaching distant towns, villages, and even the ears of those in power. People spoke in awe of the woman who had not merely survived her captivity, but had redefined it, creating a realm of knowledge, strategy, and resilience from the very instruments meant to suppress her. Where once fear had ruled, now reverence and curiosity followed her name. The kingdom's chroniclers, scribes, and bards began to record Kayla's exploits, piecing together her journey from prisoner to ruler of the dungeon-turned-sanctuary. They recounted how she had arrived in chains, young and courageous, accused falsely of treachery against a lord who had underestimated both her intellect and spirit. The dungeon that had been designed to crush her was described in these accounts as a place of despair, with walls cold enough to sap hope and corridors that seemed endless. Yet Kayla had walked these passages with her mind alight, her determination unshaken. Every trial, every night spent in darkness became part of the legend, proof that confinement could not limit the indomitable will of a clever and resolute heart. As word spread, a proverb emerged from the lips of villagers, guards and scholars alike. They built a cage to break her, but she built a kingdom in chains. The saying captured the essence of Kayla's story, how adversity, oppression and cruelty could be transformed into instruments of empowerment and creation. It was told to children as a lesson in courage, to scholars as an example of strategy and leadership, and to rulers as a warning that power wielded without wisdom could be outmatched by ingenuity and moral strength. Kayla herself, though she rarely sought recognition beyond her dungeon, became a symbol of resilience, her name synonymous with intelligence, strategy and moral authority. The story of the dungeon's transformation was told in meticulous detail. Chroniclers described how Kayla had trained former prisoners, turning fear into self-reliance and despair into opportunity. She had taught literacy, strategy and ethical reasoning. She had encouraged creativity, debate and collaboration. Every corridor, cell and training chamber had been repurposed, the very architecture of imprisonment converted into spaces of empowerment. Former captives became mentors to new arrivals, each passing on Kayla's lessons and reinforcing the community she had cultivated. The dungeon was no longer simply a prison. It had become a living school of resilience, a bastion of subtle authority and wisdom. Stories emphasized Kayla's leadership style. She did not rely on domination, threats, or fear. Instead, she wielded influence through respect, strategic insight, and empathy. Chroniclers marveled at how she recognized the strengths and weaknesses of those around her, nurturing potential where others saw only brokenness. Her vision created a society within the dungeon, a microcosm of fairness, balance, and cooperation that had not existed in the kingdom above. It was said that guards who had expected obedience without question were subtly challenged, not by force, but by the silent confidence and strategic acumen of Kayla and her students. Tales circulated of guards being outmaneuvered without confrontation, learning humility in the face of intellect and preparation. Kayla's legend grew not only because of the dungeon itself but because of the moral dimension she instilled. Every story highlighted her insistence on justice tempered by compassion. She did not seek revenge on those who had wronged her or other prisoners, though she could have. Instead, she fostered transformation. Her former captives became teachers, strategists, and leaders, capable of effecting change both inside and beyond the dungeon walls. Tales told of how the dungeon had produced thinkers who could anticipate challenges, plan with foresight, and act decisively yet ethically. The legend presented Kayla as a beacon of the principle that true power lies in wisdom, adaptability, and moral clarity, not in brute force. Travelers described her influence extending beyond the dungeon. Merchants and messengers spoke of towns subtly shaped by those who had trained under Kayla, individuals who brought intelligence, fairness, and resilience wherever they went. Even local rulers reportedly took note, curious about the emerging figures who combined strategic acumen with ethical governance. The dungeon had become, indirectly, a training ground for leaders whose capabilities could challenge tyranny, influence politics, and stabilize communities. Kayla's legacy, therefore, was not confined to the underground walls. It permeated the kingdom, a quiet but unstoppable force shaping the social and political landscape. The bards, in particular, loved the poetic elements of Kayla's story. They described her chains not as instruments of oppression, but as conduits of power and symbols of transformation. Each link of iron, once intended to subdue her, became a reminder of her ingenuity and resilience. Songs told of how she had taught prisoners to see opportunity in constraint, how she had turned instruments of suffering into tools for growth. These songs were sung across villages, carrying with them lessons of courage, resourcefulness, and moral fortitude. Children learned that adversity was not a mark of weakness, but a canvas for creativity and strength. Every verse celebrated the intelligence, patience, and vision required to transform chains into symbols of empowerment. Another enduring aspect of Kayla's legend was her strategic mastery. Chroniclers highlighted her ability to map the dungeon, understand patrol patterns, and identify weaknesses without ever breaking confinement. She trained others to do the same, teaching them to think several steps ahead and to anticipate challenges with logic and foresight. The dungeon, once a symbol of power wielded through fear, had become a school of critical thinking, teaching those who were observant, disciplined, and collaborative how to act decisively in the face of adversity. The legend emphasized that Kayla's triumph was as much intellectual as it was moral, a story of mental acuity matched by ethical fortitude. The story also included personal accounts of those who had benefited from her guidance. Former prisoners described how Kayla had inspired confidence, teaching them to believe in their abilities despite years of neglect and abuse. They spoke of the pride that came from mastery over previously incomprehensible skills, the satisfaction of understanding the mechanisms of control, and the joy of contributing to a cooperative, respectful society. Many of these individuals went on to influence the world beyond the dungeon, carrying Kayla's principles into broader communities. Her teachings became part of the oral and written culture, forming a foundation for governance, mentorship, and personal development across generations.